What's up, everybody? I'm Derek, this is Rocking eForge, and it is already December. How on earth did that happen? But regardless, I am going to be starting a couple of videos, or a sequence of videos that get into either Christmas gifts or holiday-related decorations that you can make at home. Today I'm going to be forging a simple icicle to be hung on a Christmas tree, so let's get rocking. Alright, so we are starting with a piece of 3/8 inch square stock. Now you can start with any size stock that you want and make any size icicle that you want. This is just what I have on hand, and I think this size and smaller make really nice small icicles for hanging on Christmas trees or decorating your house for the holidays. And I'm just going to draw a forward square taper on this bar and draw that up the bar until I feel like I've got enough length out of it. I always start drawing the taper right at the very tip and drawing that down to about the final dimension that I want before I start drawing that back, so that I don't end up with a lot of extra length because I started way back in the actual stock. If you start at the tip and draw that out further and further up the bar, in my experience, you waste less material, and I end up with a much more consistent taper that way, as opposed to just starting and trying to draw down the whole length of the taper the entire time. And while you don't have to make this perfect, obviously, the final product will look much nicer if you can keep the surface of each face as flat and uniform as possible, because we're going to put a decorative twist in this later on once we've got the final shape hammered out. And the nicer and flatter each face is, the better the final look will be, because it just kind of all blends together. So the next thing I'm going to do is simply just planish each face to knock in every little bulge and kind of even out the surface based on errant hammer blows, or just spots where I hammered a little harder in one spot and not as hard in another. And yes, I know I just said I'm going to planish, but which is usually done near a black heat. But I'm going to start at a higher heat to make sure that that transition point from the square bar to the actual taper blends nicely, because I'm going to incorporate part of that square stock that isn't tapered into the overall piece. But now you see I'm just doing pretty light blows at a black heat in order to just even out all of the surfaces and make them as smooth and uniform as possible. I'm not doing full force forging blows here, just very light tapping to even out all of those lumps and bumps. And just straighten everything out. And that's looking pretty good. So next step we're gonna do is just cut this off, and I'm thinking about a 6 to 7 inch. Yeah, I'm thinking about a 6-inch icicle here. And then we'll go ahead and spin this around and forge on the cut end to make a nice looking little loop to hang on the tree, or what I'm going to do is tie a red ribbon to it and then use that to hang on my Christmas tree. I measured out 6 to 7 inches here, about 6.5 inches, and put a mark here with one of my chisels just to give me a guideline of where I want to cut. All right, so I'm going to clean this up on the grinder, and then I'm going to start drawing out another taper on this end in order to forge in a loop. And I'm just going to fit this in a pair of my tongs. And in order to hang on to it better, I'm going to use one of my tong clips that I forged in my previous video, which allows me to lock the piece in the jaws of my tongs and then put the whole piece in the fire without having to fiddle around with picking it up time and time again, which can be occasionally mildly challenging, with a taper of this style, and I really like doing this now that I've made these tong clips. And I'm going to draw a two-sided taper here. And this is becoming my favorite way to establish a loop or a hook on a piece of square stock. In that I'm going to draw it down on one corner or toward one corner of the square stock, scroll it, and then curl it over on the diagonal, which I think looks really nice, as opposed to forging a sweeping taper. But as you can see with these bottle openers that I've forged, you can take this any number of ways that you want. This is the loop forged on that diagonal, and I rounded this loop. This is a square tapered loop, and that is slightly tapered all the way down on one axis. It's a four-sided square taper, obviously, but tapered with a bias toward one face as opposed to the corner like this one. You can do this any number of ways. You could also just forge the entire thing down into a taper and then forge that into a loop as well, if that's what you think you want. However, if you want to do this style of that loop, the better that you can keep this edge in line with that edge, the nicer this is going to look overall. So you really want to take your time when it comes to establishing that shoulder while you are in the early stages of forging this loop. And now I'm going to jump to the far edge of the anvil and just draw this into a simple square taper. Starting with the tip again, and then blending that back into the body. I'm making an effort to not get too far back here and messing up that corner with a hammer strike. I'm going to clean up that kind of bulge or extra material there by just bringing it back to the near edge of the anvil and hammering that down to the same thickness as the rest of the taper, or continuing that taper rather. Now I'm just going to draw this down to a very thin, elegant taper, and then I'm going to probably knock off all of these corners so it's not so sharp, and ends up giving it a bit of a softer appearance. And I'm simply going to just bounce back and forth from the near edge to the far edge to work out this taper, making sure to keep it as square as I can keep it. And to be perfectly clear, in order to avoid messing up this shoulder, you definitely don't want to try to hammer on the piece in this orientation or this orientation, where that shoulder is in contact with the surface of the anvil, but this portion of what's going to be the loop is not supported by the anvil face, which is why you find me seating that shoulder into the edge of the anvil in order to forge back here, and then flipping it such that these surfaces that go all the way to the tip of the taper are in contact with the anvil at all times while I'm forging on this taper itself. And now that I've got that worked out, like I said earlier, I'm just going to knock down all of the corners on the piece. Just to give it a softer, maybe a little more natural look. Making sure to keep all of those as even as I can. Now, obviously, icicles don't grow square. They tend to be round or kind of bulbous and crooked and non-uniform. But I think softening those corners or breaking down those corners gives it a very nice look. And you want to keep most of that square cross-section if you're going to do a decorative twist, just simply because square twists better and the twist becomes more apparent than if you have a rounder cross-section. So I'm not going to round this up. I'm not going to take this all the way to round. I'm going to keep it just like this because that's the look I'm going for. And I'm going to come in and touch mark before I twist. And if you have a touch mark or touch mark your pieces and are doing this on a piece that you're going to twist, you definitely want to do that prior to twisting the piece, because that whole face can be in contact with the anvil, nice and flat, and allow you to get a nice pressure into the anvil with my touch mark punch. But if you were to twist that, suddenly the point at which the steel is twisted is significantly wider than the surrounding steel, and as such, when you're trying to touch mark a flat piece, it's actually going to be sitting up off the anvil on the points of the twist, and you will flatten that portion of the twist underneath it, or you're going to struggle with trying to keep the tiny little portion of the piece off the anvil while you're trying to touch mark it, and you can eliminate all of that struggle and all of that messing up the twist by simply just touch marking before you do the twist. And then I'm just gonna finish squaring up those corners that I didn't do earlier. And next, we're gonna put the decorative twist in here and finally shape this loop, and we'll be all finished. All right, so now I'm going to quench this piece in two places. The tip of the icicle and at the shoulder where I'm going to be putting the wrench to twist this piece. And the reason for that is because thinner portions of the material get hotter quicker, and the more material that you're twisting, the harder it is to twist, which means in a tapered piece, you will get more of a twist in the thinner portion of the piece than you will in the thicker portion of that taper. And in this particular icicle that I'm trying to forge, I want that twist kind of concentrated in the middle of the icicle, leaving the end of it just as a simple square taper. And I'm doing this by controlling where the heat is concentrated so that the hottest portion of the taper itself is the location that I'm going to be twisting. And the cold portions, i.e. where I'm locking it in the jaws of the vise and where I'm attaching or affixing the twisting wrench, is not going to deform or get bite marks or marks in it from the clamping force because it's cold. Now I'm trying to make sure that the flat faces line up from one side of the twist to the other, and that can be a bit of a challenge, especially when your vice jaws rack. But I think I've got it. And side note, I will eventually make a twisting wrench, but using my bending wrench and this adjustable wrench worked out pretty all right in getting a nice even twisting force in both directions, as opposed to in previous videos where I've just been cranking on it with one and getting quite a bend out of it by the end of it. Now, as you can see, there is a little bit of a bend regardless, and what I'm going to do there is I'm going to go ahead and throw this back in the fire to get it hot, and then take it to my stump to even everything out so that I'm not striking on that twist with a hard hammer or striking it on the hard face of my anvil, which will flatten everything out and kind of ruin everything in the long run. And it does look like I might need to come back in and twist a little bit farther to get the flat faces line up, but I'm gonna take a look once I've got everything flattened out and see if I need to do that. And now I'm just going to go ahead and put a rat tail or a penny scroll on this by just forging it over the edge of the anvil, coming in and finishing it up by forging down on it. And then I'm using the edge of the anvil to tighten up that tip before I forge that more round. And when you're forging a scroll like this that's going to be used in a loop, you want to forge in the direction away from where the loop is actually going to form. Otherwise, the scroll will end up on the inside of the loop, which may also look nice if that's the look you're going for, but for me, that is not. And then I'm going to cool that scroll off prior to coming to the horn of the anvil and simply just bending that into the loop that we were looking for. And the reason I cool the scroll off is to avoid, now it's still getting a little bit of deformation because of how small it is. but it's to avoid deforming that scroll as much as possible while you're coming in and forging that loop. Now I ended up with that loop kind of overlapping the piece down here, and that's not where I wanted it, so I used the tip of the horn there to open up the loop by forging on the non-supported piece here, which actually bent that loop that direction. And then I'm going to come in, hammer that back down so that the scroll rests in the tip of that shoulder. That ended up putting a little bit of a bend, as you can see, this direction, so I'll need to correct that on the face of the anvil here. And I went ahead and threw that back in the fire just briefly, got it up to red to orange along the length, and I'm just gonna brush off any extra forge scale here to make sure that there's nothing that'll chip off or anything. And then I really like coming in with a layer of beeswax, making sure to let it cool down a little bit so that the beeswax will actually melt instead of immediately burning. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. And I like using wax while the piece is still pretty hot to seal it and prevent rust. This will darken the appearance of the steel itself as well. And you want to do that while the steel is still hot enough for that wax to smoke, kind of burns onto the surface, making sure to get every surface of the piece while it's still hot. Which is also why, if you ever see my anvil smoking, I get wax all over my anvil face. And then I come in with a shop towel or a thick towel to wipe off all of that excess, but please make sure you do not burn yourself. And this illustrates perfectly why, if you're going to touch mark a piece, you want to touch mark it prior to twisting, because the twist is thicker than the actual square cross section of the piece itself, and you'll flatten the edges of the twist when you put in the touch mark on your piece. All right, so I've determined that one unfortunate reality is it's very heavy. So hopefully you have very strong branches on your Christmas tree. And that's going to do it for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me and the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video, or please consider becoming a member on my YouTube channel. And as always, keep on rockin'.